for the Jews during that time. But one Theodor Herzl was convinced that he was innocent of charge, but through this process and the way the world was reacting to Dreyfus, he realized that the Jews needed a land of their own. And it was through that trial. He wrote books and he wrote pamphlets, and I don't have the names of those pamphlets and books in there, but it talked about the return of the Jews. Reverend Herzl, who was a chaplain for the British, consulate or something, and he read one of these pamphlets, and he introduced him to this Wilhelm, this leader, Wilhelm I, I think it was, who in essence set up this meeting, and it began the process, the ball rolling, for him to be heard and for Herzl to begin what's called the Zionist movement. And Blackstone actually wrote to Herzl, because Herzl, I believe, wanted to have the Promised Land in not Australia, but Argentina, is where he wanted to. And Blackstone says, no, it is Israel, to the mountains of Israel. And Herzl realized that he was right with all the scriptures he had said to him, and changed his mind and focused back on getting into the land of Palestine. Blackstone was very influential there. And then the story goes on, you have this Louis Brandeis, and all this we read about in the book here. He became, he was part of Woodrow Wilson's cabinet, and he also became a member of the Zionist movement, and so it was through his influence with Woodrow Wilson. Later on, he was the first Jewish member of the Supreme Court under Woodrow Wilson, so he was. Then Arthur James Balfour was also under commission to investigate and bring about some type of treaty, some type of plan for the re-engagement of Palestine for the Jews. Why? Because Chaim Weizmann, a Jew, came up with, was gifted, because the British and the French were being hammered by the Germans, because the Germans had something, a machine gun. They were losing the war. Weizmann, a Jew, came up with a way of putting all this together, and came up with a machine gun, which helped them win the war. And this happened. So Weizmann was asked, how can we repay you? You know what his answer was? Support a refounding of Israel and the land of Palestine. So that's where Balfour. So Balfour got together with this Brandeis, and it all came together. And in the book, he talks about these three Jews who were very prominent, and all three of them, Herzl and this Brandeis, and another one I can't think of his name. The three of them were not Orthodox Jews. They were not Jews who were big on Israel or anything else, but God used them. God used them and put them in places. And then finally, it was in 1970 that General Allenby, and we'll look more into this later, his whole story told on page 66 and 68, how the fulfillment of a prophecy in Isaiah was fulfilled when he liberated Jerusalem, and the prophecy had to do with the wings and the flying over Jerusalem would take place. And the story goes that they didn't want to destroy Jerusalem, they didn't want to fire upon it, and so these orders were put out, whatever, pray about it and do what you think is best. So what they did was they took a biplane, they flew over Jerusalem, they dropped these leaflets telling the Muslims, you better surrender, because if you don't surrender, then it's going to be, and the Muslims knew this prophecy concerning Alabi, or something in their prophecies concerning one named General Alabi. They thought it was fulfillment of a prophecy of what they had as well. And the story goes on, get this, it was a French cook. A French cook went out, and he didn't have any eggs. He didn't have any eggs for breakfast that day. And he heard the hens crowing, the roosters crowing. And he says, well, there's roosters, there's hens, or there's hens, there's eggs. And so he's walking down the road, and he's thinking he's going to this place where he heard the hen, and he ended up in Jerusalem. And he runs across these people coming at him with a white flag. And he says, I'm not here to negotiate surrender, I'm looking for eggs. And they were surrendering because of these leaflets that fell out of the sky. And they look at it as a fulfillment of this prophecy in Isaiah. So God was working, and this was the end of the Ottoman Empire. So all this led to, in 1948, the state of Israel being reborn. And in 1917, the Zionist movement, Herzl, and the fall of the Ottoman Empire made it possible. So in 1948, with the Balfour Agreement, Israel's made a nation again. It's proclaimed, and the Arab nations attack, but lose to the Jewish state. In 1967, the Six-Day War takes place, and that's where Israel really clobbered them. It definitely was David and Goliath. On October 6th, the Yom Kippur War in 1973, Israel almost lost it. The United States came forth and resupplied Israel with all its losses, its tanks and everything else. But it was like a 10-1 odds, I think. October 6, 1973, Yom Kippur, the holiest day, the Jewish calendar, Egypt and Syria opened a coordinated surprise attack against Israel. The equivalent of the total forces of NATO in Europe were mobilized on Israel's borders. On the Golan Heights, approximately 180 Israeli tanks faced an onslaught of 1,400 Syrian tanks. Along the Suez Canal, 463 Israeli defenders were attacked by 80,000 Egyptians. How did they win? Divine intervention. That's exactly what it is. God intervened, and Israel is still there. Now, today, Israel is the focus of 40% of the UN dealings. Well, it's tiny little Israel. 40% of the dealings, whose destruction is actually actively being sought by the president of Iran, Ahmadinejad, which is Persia, who was also building a nuclear bomb and delivery system. Oh, here we are. For I will take you, I'll take you from the nations and gather you from all the lands and bring you into your own land, Ezekiel. Now you know what fills that gap. There's a lot there, isn't there? Yes. There's a lot there, and so now I believe we're ready, really, to get into, the study of prophecy in the book of Ezekiel and Joel. So now we're ready to understand Ezekiel 38 and 39. We're ready to understand the book of Joel. We're ready to understand the book of Revelation, and we're ready to understand God's plan for the ages and what He has. Now, interestingly, 1945 to 2011, 66 years have passed since the liberation of Auschwitz. From 1948 to 2011 is 63 years. That's where we're at today. 7 years from now is 7 years or one generation. Now, let's turn to Matthew chapter 24. Now, go to your sheets. This is on your sheet, your first sheet of your second sheet, page number 2. Now, learn the parable of a fig tree, verse 32 of Matthew 24. When its branch is yet tender and putteth forth leaves, you know the summer is nigh. So likewise, when you see all these things, know that it is near, even at the doors. Verily I say unto you, this generation shall not pass till all these things be fulfilled. Heaven and earth shall pass away, but my word shall not pass away. But of that day and hour knoweth no man, no, not the angels of heaven, but my Father only. So, I put this up as you look at it. A generation is about 7 years. And so as I look at the nation of Israel and all that God has done, and the story of Blackstone and all the presidents and all the conversations and everything done, and all the miracles that took place for the rebirth of the nation of Israel, when people said, impossible, fanciful, never going to happen, right? You're crazy. It happened because God's word said it must happen. And we can look back at it, 1948. I was born 3 years later, 51. I was born 3 years later. And now here we are. We took 2011, and we're looking at the fact that Israel's been a nation since 48. That's 63 years. And so what's next? And we see Ahmadinejad. We see them crying out for the 12th Imam. And the 12th Imam fits perfectly with the character of Antichrist. And we see them building a bomb. And we see what's happening in that area right now. Well, they're trying to rebuild the caliphate. All right? The greater part of scriptures consists of prophecy, and if Christians would give more attention to it, they would not find themselves distracted from the present service, but they would find much light thrown on their present path. Much practical encouragement given to their ministry. This is what he said, I read this in the beginning. Their faith would rest upon a broader and deeper comprehension of God's character and the ways, and their spiritual horizon would stand out in clearer outline than before. And so here's what we need to understand. Here we are in the United States today, And we're looking over at the Middle East. And what are they trying to rebuild? The caliphate. And you heard a lot about the Brotherhood. When the Brotherhood's trying to push Sharia law. Why? Because as a Muslim look back at their history, as they look at, quote, the great catastrophe, and that's what it was when the Balfour Agreement was put into action. That's what took place. The great catastrophe, when Jerusalem fell into the hands of the British, that was the beginning of the great catastrophe. They believe that happened because of the influence of the West, that too many Muslims weren't adherent to the laws and the teachings of Islam. Therefore, the Brotherhoods come up with this idea of implementing Sharia law so that they can influence the West and protect the Muslim from the influence of the West. So by implementing Sharia law, it places a Muslim under strict adherence to Muslim law because they believe if they don't do that, they're not going to be able to conquer and rule the world for all. And so Sharia law is key to the Brotherhood, and so they're trying to bring about the rebuilding of the caliphate. That is what's happening over in the Middle East. Not democracy, but the rebirth of the Ottoman Empire. And Turkey was at the very heart of that. And so we're standing in the precipice of that. The fall of the Ottoman Empire allowed the Jewish nation to rebuild. So what will the rise of the caliphate then mean for Israel? Right? And the Arabs sit on all the oil, they've got all the money, and the United States is collapsing. We're collapsing from within, we're collapsing economically. Why? Because I think God's finished. I think God's finished. We've done it. We've done our job per se. There's still a lot of souls to be saved, but the stage is set for Bible prophecy and for the Word of God to be fulfilled. Now, I want to close with this. I have in my hand